Hello, world. Welcome back to the Pocket Gamer podcast with your host, me, Brian Baglow, and this week the perfectly Paisley, Peggy and Salz.
Perfectly Paisley and Peggy. You're into alliteration. You were at the top of your game today, I think, Brian.
Oh, listen, I have a list of puns that we need to fit into this episode, so you're going to have to bear with us, Teemu, because it could take a couple of goes just to fit them
Yeah.
all in. But we love a pun on the
We
podcast.
love a pun, we love a joke.
You see,
It's good weather, it's a good vibe. Seriously, as always, a great guest this time, Teemu Haila. He is co-founder and chief product officer at Metaplay. Brian will hear about that, but more importantly, our audience will benefit because it's all about how to scale when you're a small studio, and that is a never-ending problem. He's faced it firsthand. That's why we have him on the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
welcome on board, Teemu. Yeah, I'm familiar with Metaplay. I'm familiar with quite a lot of the companies that you've had experience with. So we're really glad to have you here, and I just want to dive in. So let's dig into this your journey in games, I guess, from co-founding PlayRaven to starting Metaplay. PlayRaven, of course, going on to be acquired by Rovio. Tell us more. How did you get into games? How did it all come to be? And how did you end up where you are now?
That'll take a couple of hours, but I'll try to condense it down into a few highlights. I actually started with quote founding Finland's first online gaming communities back in the day when like GeoCities was the coolest thing available on the internet.
I remember it
So
well.
right, so it was about being in school and trying to figure out how do we bring people together around all of the things that we love, which was mostly RuneScape and Counter-Strike and all that before esports was a thing. And it's all been downhill since then, really. So then I went on to study games professionally before game studies were a thing in Finland. So we ended up then founding Finland's first game development club back in the day. Then we founded Finland's first non-profit sort of co-ops on top of those clubs to make it easier to study games. Went on to work a lot with IGDA Finland. So Finland has a very strong games community branded around IGDA. I got a lifetime award from there a few years back because it's been a long time with this stuff. And then that actually kind of all leads into working in games, where I entered the industry just around the time when like Facebook gaming was big. So we sort of started getting the Western free-to-play games and kind of learning how to do that. So I was a game lead at Vuga, working on their first mobile titles when Facebook was still the biggest thing, and nobody knew what mobile was going to be with the first iPhones and all that. Like it wasn't clear at all that mobile is going to be as big as it is today. So it's been interesting because then we sort of trying to understand what's next every single time we make a new game, or ended up founding PlayRaven with the idea that there's such a large mass market, the biggest mass market of our time, mobile phones, these devices, that there must be new forms of games and entertainment that no one's ever done before. Let's go and find out what that is. Nowadays we know it had a lot to do with the modern free-to-play on mobile and the kind of games that we've ended up creating there, which has to do with live ops and so on, which just did not exist back in the day. So it's my career really has been to try and kind of spearhead or explore that with, talented people from the industry. Nowadays, mostly in my own companies, funnily enough. So if I kind of narrow that down into the post-Rovio era, if you will. So Rovio acquired PlayRaven. Very grateful of that, of course. And I was kind of asking myself, what's next? Right? Like, what do I want to do at this point? And I think this was about 5 years ago now, 6 years ago. And already then, for me, it kind of became clear that this is going to be even more about the kind of marketing problem that we have nowadays, where you have to have a high LTV to be sustaining your ads, to make your own discovery. We can't trust Apple or Google or whoever to just donate us free players every single day. We have to make this work. And that means that you have to have a game that has such a long lifespan, that's engaging over time, that can really grow its own audience. And that boils down to, say, live ops for one thing, and it's like online services or games as a service, as we call it now. So for me, then, as a startup founder, I'm thinking, okay, we've done that before. Let's do it again. what's it going to cost? Or like, what do we need to build to make that happen? What can we buy? What do we need to make? And it actually kind of boils down into, well, it's going to be a lot of millions. We spend a lot of millions at PlayRaven building our own tech stack. And Rovio is incidentally known for their amazing backend technology, which they call Beacon, which is really the secret sauce, if you will, on how they're able to grow Angry Birds nowadays. So it kind of starts from, okay, let's build that ourselves. And that probably means raising 2 or 3 extra millions.
That's what we have in Metaplay, is exactly that, building it. And to get to that point, you talk about games as a service. I think you've got a new one. I think we'll call it Scale as a Service. Would that sort of fit what you're doing there?
I think that's kind of on the money, right? Because and the way I think about it is that we often talk about time to market as a sort of this first thing. Let's make games and let's try to be really quick at getting them to market. But it turns out it's not enough to have a game out there and not be successful. Like what you really want is time to scale, if you will. How do we make something that can be a big game? Because that's what we need for the business to make sense because of the free-to-play dynamic. So yeah, exactly. Then Metaplay was exactly founded on that idea of this is a hard problem to solve, especially if you're making games at the same time. So what if we founded a company that was specifically trying to solve this one problem really well, and maybe then we can all focus on making games instead of solving all of these problems at once. And that's really where kind of Metaplay came in from. How do we solve the problem of time to scale?
And cut it. I mean, cut it by, just curious, cut it by how much do you think?
How much in terms of like how can we accelerate time to scale?
Accelerate the scale. Is it a question of like, because I'm familiar with you, but I'm obviously not a studio owner, and I'm just curious, is it more a time that you're focused on, or a money, or a bit of both?
Yeah, we can put some numbers on it. So it took us about 2 to 3 years to make a backend that could actually scale to hundreds of millions of players. And it might take a little bit more or less depending on how much you staff it. And if you nowadays would use Metaplay to kind of do the same thing, we will get you there in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Like that's the difference between building it versus taking something that's already been built. So that's massive. And then the other number is, do you have to hire people to do this, or can you get away with a smaller founding team? So now we're starting to talk about, well, how much do you save in salaries and complexity of your studio? So I'd want to say you save maybe 2 or 3 key hires in the beginning of your studio, and then maybe save essentially one team later on in your studio. So now we're starting to talk about $1 million a year of US salaries saved on a bigger studio easily, because you might be saving, say 5 people out of your headcount plus overhead and so on. So we're talking big numbers.
That's really, really interesting. And, it's clear from the outset there's going to be an awful lot involved in this, Teemu. So we're really lucky that you literally wrote this down. You call it the 4 pillars of scaling in your blog series. We'll link to this in the show notes, and we encourage every listener out there to check it out and find out more. But can you just give us a little insight and, whet their taste buds a little and break down each pillar for us? Just even roughly, just so we get a sense of what it is that you see as the crucial aspects of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So where this 4 pillars thing really came from was that it's, as you say, it's such a complex, large topic that it's even difficult to talk about. So we tried to spend a little bit of time, a little bit, I mean, the last 5 years of our time, even trying to break this down into something that we can, talk about inside the Metaplay and with other studios. And it's sort of come down to 4 major things that happen as you get your first viral hit. Number 1, you start to get a lot of players into your game. So number of players goes up dramatically. And that means that those players need service, as well as you hit every single technical tipping point in a very negative way that's possible. So anything that can go wrong will go wrong when you have enough players in. So that's problem number 1. So problem number 2 is more that your game is never done. So usually when you have, let's call it the minimum viable product or whatever that goes in the market that you think is promising and will start to scale, but then when you really want to get it to top grossing, then you kind of have to fill out the rest of your vision. So you still need to work on your long-term social metagame features. Like usually that means adding in guilds, adding in seasonal leaderboard structures, all kinds of event systems, lots of content. So the complexity of your game goes up. That's the important bit. Not only do you have all these players, but now your game becomes systemically more complex, and it's harder and harder and harder to make the game more kind of intricate, if you will. So that's problem number 2. And both of these things, if they sound complicated, it is because they are. And that usually means that then number 3, your team size starts to go up. Because of course, you need more people to solve all of these problems in parallel. And as we know, when you get more people, then, that's a whole deal of people management, and also how to keep that team then productive, which is surprisingly difficult. Because as we know, like more mothers don't necessarily give birth to a single baby faster. So these things can be difficult to actually scale out. And then number 4, at the same time, you're now a revenue generating business, which means that we're starting to talk about getting more revenue out of the game to kind of sustain the head count and everything that we're doing. We want to start to optimize all of that. And we start to talk about boring things like business continuity, which is obviously really important if we're now talking about the business that's maybe generating 200 million a year. So you also want certain guarantees that that's not just going to crash and burn tomorrow for a reason that we could maybe prevent. So 4 things: number of players, game complexity, the team size, and then the revenue that we now suddenly have to solve that we didn't necessarily have to solve while we were kind of pre-launch or early days of the game.
Very tricky though, however. Maybe I'll start with one and we can sort of tag back and forth here, Brian, to dive down a little bit deeper. Let's just start with something as simple as you have more players, right? You have more players, more to manage. So maybe you can name a strategy, a technology, whatever it is you suggest for keeping the player experience as smooth as possible when the user base is growing.
Yeah. So there's maybe 2 sides of that coin that are like the most important that we just everybody needs to figure out one way or the other. One side is technical, meaning that the source of the way I put it simply is that the source of technical trouble usually is that it's a surprise, right? Like something went wrong, meaning we weren't expecting things to fail, but they did. So that the kind of short way of saying is that not all technology behaves at scale as you'd expect it to. So what we really need to do is try it out. Hopefully not with real players, but try to do a massive playtest or like simulated playtest using bots that really looks and feels like you had 1 million players suddenly come into the game. And that will just like crash and burn in all kinds of interesting ways that we can now talk about and we kind of know where we stand. The problem usually is that we don't know where we stand, and then we launch a new game and the servers are down. Like that's the nightmare scenario. We don't want to be surprised. So of course, from Metaplay's point of view, what we can do is that we can kind of give you a piece of technology that we've already seen live with hundreds of millions of players. So there's all kinds of surprises that we have already had to deal with so that you don't have to. So that's obviously one way of looking at it. Then maybe the other side that I think is interesting and often kind of missed is less technical and more customer support. So if you now have, again, millions of players playing your game every single day, and then there's a problem in the game, then they will try to contact you and maybe tell you about it, like report the issue. So you might be facing tens of thousands of people talking at you at the same time. And that is that kind of, how do you manage that? And the answer obviously is that you need all kinds of ticketing systems, whether it's like Helpshift or Zendesk or something to just manage that flood of information coming in. But then you need some kind of a way to efficiently deal with all the requests are coming in. And that usually means that you're working with a partner studio, like Keywords is a very famous one. So that you can have hundreds and hundreds of customer support agents working with your studio in all languages, just answering players and maybe giving them in-game resources and connecting accounts to lost devices, that sort of thing. But if you don't have tools to give out in-game rewards and connecting things to devices, then we have a problem. So you do need essentially, like before this happens, you need to have a pipeline for just receiving that player message traffic and then being able to have like an admin tool to actually then resolve it. And it's a little bit unfortunate that you have to do it before you have a problem. You can't sort of wing it on the spot. It just doesn't work, if that makes sense.
Teemu, you mentioned team size, headcount is one of these compounding factors that can cause problems. And, you've just told us that, the number of players can massively push up the number of tickets, requests for help, problems, community management, etc. And I'm wondering if this shift in focus away from development into then servicing your players is perhaps one of the factors underlying a lot of the redundancies and layoffs that we've been seeing in the game sector over the last 12 to 18 months as studios shift from making the thing to then running the thing, servicing the thing. Do you think that's playing a role?
Yeah, so this is something where actually the mobile industry is, I think, ahead of the console industry. And a lot of the layoffs we're seeing today are happening from the traditional, more like PC console studios. So I don't think this is as big of a driver. But what I do see happening, which I do think is quite interesting, is that generally the most successful game studios that operate in this very, very advanced kind of games as a service space, you're right that there's a huge, let's call it capital investment into building the upfront game. And then the most clever studios actually have a relatively small skeleton crew that is then driving most of the live ops because they're using such an efficient tool set that they don't necessarily need like 20 programmers to add more content to the game. They can have brilliant content designers who are able to, using the tools, able to push new stuff in. So yes, there's less of a need for that initial development team. But I think what I'm seeing mostly in the industry at the moment is that those teams that are brilliant at making the new games, they generally are then shifted to work on some, like the next new title. So I feel like the layoff situation, which is really unfortunate, I feel like that is more being underlined that the live service style industry, I think, is kind of replacing a lot of the premium type of making games. So a lot of the games that are getting cancelled, and a lot of people that are getting laid off, are actually from some more premium projects that don't necessarily have like financial viability in the market at the moment. I think it's a really interesting dynamic.
So what's the solution for the companies out there that are facing these four pillars of complexity and challenge? Is it just down to the tool set? Is it down to automation, or is there something deeper that needs to be understood there in order to let a studio navigate this complexity?
I'd love to say that just use Metaplay, but really, yeah, it is a little bit deeper. I think it comes down to even like the founding ethos of the studio itself, of like what problems are we here to solve, right? Like the best, well, when I say best, I mean like the most interesting startups that we work with nowadays that are even in this harsh climate that are able to raise funds and start new ventures. I feel like they have very strongly founded with the understanding that they will be aiming for a very large live service game. And because this is true, now they are deeply thinking about the four pillars that we are here discussing. They're basically saying that it really is deep thought going into them, and then deciding who are part of the founding team and who are going to be the first key hires, and what are the trade-offs that you're going to do. Usually it means things like, let's maybe not focus on the graphics as much, because if we do, then the content is going to be extremely expensive later on. It's not that it isn't cool, it is, but it's going to be impossibly expensive to add more content if that's sort of the graphics level that you're setting, for example. So those are more like creative decisions that you're making early on because you're mindful of where those decisions will take you later on. And of course, for a lot of it, I gotta say, technology helps, of course. That we've now spent at Metaplay the past 5 years, and I want to say roughly 10 million or so working on a tech so far, and we'll be spending another 10 million very shortly on it, just in salaries. So obviously it helps to sort of piggyback off of that instead of having to solve it at the same time. So yes.
It's fascinating how many new games are either not released or are killed before they are fully launched. And so what I'm hearing here is that trend of not wanting to jump in there with a new release and then having to get and extract all the value possible out of existing games through live ops. That works. That's what we're seeing, that dynamic. But in live ops, it's not just about the content, it's about planning. How can you stretch and grow the game as you grow the player base? So I'd like to ask you what you're advising companies you're working with to do that, because the way forward is not necessarily to grow the audience through the typical usual live ops. You really have to think outside the box.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a super, super interesting question. And we actually spend a huge amount of time in the Finnish industry, just the game designers trying to understand this, like what do we build? What's meaningful? And I think my kind of number one advice there is to fundamentally design the game around like the entertainment experience of your game around this concept of new content coming in. Like it, the game can actually, you can leave a lot of stuff out of the game and leave it as a sort of placeholder of like, we will have events. I don't know what those events are going to be, but we will have events and they will be amazing. Like this is a game about events, for example, and then you don't have to have separate single player progression modes or anything else necessarily. So you can kind of save a lot of time and only focus on the thing which basically making live ops the defining feature of the game instead of a sort of cute sideshow. And I think an amazing example of that is Helldivers 2, incidentally. Not even talking about the mobile game in this case, but Helldivers being a popular thing at the moment where when you play it, you strongly feel like you're being like the developers are almost directly talking to you, the player, through the game, almost like a game master or running an RPG. And that is the experience that I'm here for. And thus, they don't necessarily need to have a campaign. So it's easy to say, for me to say a thing like this, but it's a very, very different way of designing a game as a live service, like fundamentally. And if we do that, I think we're already like 70% thinking about exactly the right things, because then from there we start to think about, okay, well, what kind of tools do we need? And is the content maybe localized? Does it happen at the same time on every single time zone, or should it be more like local to your time zone? And this is exactly the right headspace to be in, I feel like.
Yeah, I'm going to stick with the whole notion of live ops, Teemu, and ask about that content pipeline. You've just said keeping the content fresh, not necessarily knowing exactly what's going to be in there in terms of events, but how would you advise studios, especially smaller studios, to kind of look at that content pipeline? Is it just kind of building in the hooks from the initial launch and knowing, we have the ability to drop things in, or do you have to be far more organised and know 6 to 12 months out exactly what you're going to be doing? And does it vary by the sort of the size and scale of the project?
That is an excellent question, and it's unironically a $200 million question. So, and I want to say this has not been solved in the games industry yet. Like we don't know. Ask me again in 5 years. But what I think is at the moment the cutting edge answer to that is that your content pipeline from us as a team. When I say content pipeline, that's such a boring word. What I mean is that how do we as developers come together to make something new in the game, and how do we push it out and do that as efficiently as possible? That content pipeline will look very different for you as a startup, for as a 5-person team or a 10-person team, to when you are the same team, when you have a successful game and you are 150 people. Those 150 people will be falling over each other left and right if you have the same sort of working practices as when you were 5 people. And this is not a hypothetical problem, because this is literally what we want to solve. So I think what the best practice looks like at the moment, and I find this really interesting, is that you have 3 different things in your game that you need to kind of constantly update. First one is your core economy. And by that I mean, what is the power of your weapons? How much do things cost when you upgrade them? How quickly do you progress through maps, so on? That is like a holy thing that nobody can mess around with, because if you mess up the core economy, you mess up every single aspect of the game. And usually there's only 1 or 2 people who are knowledgeable of how all of that works. So there's that old wise person who kind of blesses game updates or economy updates. Now, then you have features like content that's let's call it additive on top of the economy. So I'm talking about levels, events, boss fights, whatever is the genre of your game, where when you are a small team, you have the same person working on the economy and working on the content. But when you are a big team, you actually have more like that central person who really thinks about the economy. And then you have small feature teams that in parallel work on new aspects of the game that, as you say, something might ship next week. The other thing might ship in half a year. Who knows? Like that's why we have separate teams that they can have their own timelines. Now, how do we come together and make sure that you're able to have these separate teams completely test their own version of the game and maybe publish it without kind of dragging or somehow stepping on the toes of the other teams in parallel? And the specific challenge there is, if I introduce more content to the end of the game, then I might want to rebalance the middle of the game to be a little bit faster so that players get to the new end game stuff earlier. But if I do that, then that will literally affect what the other people are doing in team number 2. So we have to suddenly, very physically, break the economy down into multiple separate files, let's call them, on disk that can be sort of worked on without causing conflict with each other. And I can talk for hours and hours about how you might do that, but that's something we have to do. And then the third part, which I find interesting, and this is new, the relatively new learnings, is that then on top of all of this, in parallel, we have the live game where we have this new class of employees in the games industry that are sometimes called live ops producers or maybe live operators that do not work with the game feature teams and do not work with the central economy. They only tweak the game live based on yesterday's analytics. So you literally have people who say, hey, we had a very successful marketing campaign in Brazil over the weekend. So we should probably put something cool in Brazil for players that have played less than a week. Like let's put something extra in that geo. So let's on Monday come together, have a meeting, come up with some graphics, upload those quickly, and by Wednesday we'll have the event out. Like that's such a fast cycle that you're just bypassing the rest of the game development team. So now what kind of tools do we build for these live ops people to kind of tweak the game while we're building the features, while we're doing the economy? And we have these kind of 3 different cadences of updating them live and so on. So my complicated answer to your simple question is that it's difficult, but once you know what it looks like, I mean, once you can imagine as a game designer what it will look like to be on top of your live game that is super popular, then we can kind of walk backwards from there and self-organize to make it possible and easy. But if by chance you didn't look forward and you just kind of end up somewhere, then it can be very, very, very difficult to kind of reorganize ourselves already on top of a live game and start to kind of build these tools ad hoc and just hope for the best.
And especially, Teemu, there are a number of companies, I won't name them, but I've spoken with the people in live ops, and it's really, that was very, very important. And they had free reign because it was about marketing and it was about making the game sustainable. But then they sort of painted themselves into a bit of a corner in that direction is more progressed than the features. So that split that you're talking about, that happens a lot. How do you possibly bring that back together if you've got that in a company? Because there are a number of smaller studios where that happened, maybe even your own.
Oh, absolutely. We had multiple teams at PlayRaven in parallel. So luckily enough, we were able to learn from each other as like separate teams and from other studios in the industry to try to preempt this a little bit. But you're right. Like at some point you find yourself in a corner. That happens. So unfortunately, some hard questions need to be asked at that point. And I find that the most difficult thing that needs to be solved first is actually on studio strategy and studio culture, because it really means that we have to give up on some idea that we had about what kind of company this is and what kind of things do we build and what kind of teams do we have. So it means a pivot of some kind. And I find that can be something where, for example, the leadership takes a very long time to change their mind, even if the people in the field struggle every day. Because if you feel that the people struggling are not necessarily the people who make decisions. Not always. And lack of empathy is a thing. So that needs to be solved. But once you have the buy-in from the people on the field and the people who make the decisions, usually it means that, okay, let's try a new tool, because that's the easiest thing you can do. Let's integrate a new tool that makes it easier for us to try a new way to run live ops in a slightly easier way. And if that's successful, let's maybe lean on into it a little bit more and sort of ship off Theseus away from this thing that seems very hard to work with, piece by piece, turn it into something that is actually very, very, very efficient to work with over time. So instead of doing one big shift, do more like many, many, many small updates and kind of build confidence that yes, this is a better way. And from Metaplay's point of view, we've done that with a couple of customers where they have a very advanced live game, and we would sort of integrate a small corner of Metaplay, if you will, and then sort of over time continue pulling the thread and make it more and more and more live opsy and whatever is the goal of the studio in that case, whatever they want to build. But yeah, honestly, it's a bit of it's a tough nut to crack, especially the cultural part of it.
What you're talking about, or what I'm taking away from that, is the ability to be agile, the ability to sort of change your mind, change those decisions, and I guess really empower your teams to do what's right, but within the context of the whole company. That's a really tough culture to inculcate and to introduce, because trusting your team without necessarily having to sort of go back for that central permission, apologize rather than ask, can be challenging for games companies, especially those who have successful successful games out there in the market. Are you seeing a lot of studios adopting this? Are you seeing them kind of embracing this, or is this another challenge that they're kind of struggling with?
Interestingly enough, the answer is sort of it's a live or die market. So whatever is the winning strategy, no matter your opinion as a studio, you will end up adopting the winning strategy at the end because there's just no other way. It's just so competitive. Meaning, if the other people are literally making more money by having a very sort of flexible and agile live ops, etc. culture in all of the live ops is one of the 4 pillars, if you call it, but across all of the pillars, if other people are better at doing it, then they might price you out of your marketing, which means that you're not growing anymore as a studio, which means that you gotta shift up a gear and get on with the program, if you will. And that's what I'm seeing. So what we're essentially seeing is new studios figuring out new, better, more efficient ways to make, honestly, more fun games, longer lasting games. And that then puts puts the screws on every other studio to do the same one way or another. So it's painful, but we are seeing studios transition always to the latest best practice one by one, whether they want it or not, which is interesting.
I'd like to follow up on that because you make the point, Brian, what are studios doing? Metaplay, of course, working with studios. So maybe you can give an example of, what you're doing, your hands-on approach, is making a difference, is putting them on this other pathway and showing us, therefore, what a blueprint could look like. I mean, it's always going to be complex. You said yourself, it's going to depends on empathy, depends on culture, a lot of variables, but what does that look like in practice? What can you show us of, yes, this works, this is the benefit, and this is the blueprint?
Let's pick customer support, actually, as a thing that usually game studios don't found themselves on, like, we're going to build an amazing customer support and then make a game. Like, usually it's the other way around. So I'll just use that as a proxy for something where a really, really, really well done customer support operation looks roughly similar for all game studios. So that just means that we can work with studios to kind of build it out year after year and try to understand what are the most important tools that your customer support agents will need. What are the really rarely needed features that you're super glad to have when you need them in a panic, and sort of bundle all of that in. So to give you a concrete example, the 2 biggest sources of customer support, the 2 most important things you need, is the ability to send in-game resources. And then number 2 is the ability for when somebody buys a new phone that they've lost the old one is to reconnect their account into the new phone so that they can continue playing. Especially if they spend tens of thousands of euros or something in the game, you kind of want them to be able to continue. So those things and more. What to your question is that yes, we can build those out, but now those features, what we literally do with our customers, very hands-on, is have a call, maybe invite them to our office, have a beer, then just open up our tool set and talk about it, of why those tools exist and what kind of problems they're solving, and then use that as a very, very concrete sort of blueprint or like a forecast of like, here's what you're gonna need to do. Let's talk about how you guys specifically want to do it, whether it's by using Metaplay or whatever, but here's what it's going to look like. So we kind of look into the future a little bit just by looking at our tools and understanding that you will have to solve these problems one way or another. And maybe customer support is like an easy, neutral one. But then we equally talk a lot about these like game configuration data and live ops, which we already spent some time talking here, exact same discussion. And ranging into something way more technical into, cloud security and backup rotations and even like audit logs and these sort of things, which are more when you have a big team, then here's how you maybe organize a big team around, a live game and make sure that you're GDPR compliant, etc., etc. Let's just like make sure you're aware of this stuff, even if it's not difficult.
We've talked about, the community management, servicing the players, but I guess the other side of this is making sure that your game is fair, even-handed. It's not being, cheated. You're not suffering from swarms of bots who are just, and cheating is prolific. So what measures can studios and partners with Metaplay take to make sure that their games remain fair and secure as they grow?
That is absolutely a massive problem, and I'll just like emphasize it by saying that no top grossing game can be cheated. Like it is such a thing. Like if your game can be cheated, there's no prior art in the known universe that you could have a game with cheaters and also have that game be one of the biggest, most successful games. This is something about cheating in games that devalues it over time, whether it means that it's not worth spending money on because clearly somebody else is just like cheating their way through, or it's easier to cheat than to pay, or whatever it means. It's super important. So if we assume that it's technologically one of the most important things that we need to solve in the beginning, the way you solve it for reals is that you build your game in a way where cheating is impossible. It's kind of easy to say, a little bit more difficult to do. And what that means for us, and as far as I know, this is the best practice for all studios that can do it roughly the same way, is that you essentially run a full copy of the game on a server that you trust. That is the server that's in your cloud, in your AWS account, is infinitely more difficult to hack than the phone that the player has, in their pocket all the time. You can never trust what's running on their phone. So essentially, you have to build the game in a way that you run a full copy of it in a server, and then only ever trust whatever the server comes up with, and get really prepared that players will try to send junks and run bots and so on to try to spoof your server. But that's no longer possible if the server runs a full copy. So now what I'm describing is essentially like a programming model. It's very almost like a philosophical level. It's a way of building a game, which can be complicated. Metaplay, that's part of what we do. It's the core of our product to make that easier. But I find that actually interesting that there's still, even today, I was speaking in a conference at Reboot, and I had fantastic follow-up conversations, some of which were exactly this. The sort of programmers coming in and asking, do I really have to? Like, do I really have to? I don't wanna. It sounds hard. And my answer was, I'm sorry, you have to. So in short, I'm sort of saying no amount of anti-cheat will work. That just will not work. What you have to do is something that's by design cheat-proof to begin with. And happily enough, mobile games have been doing that forever. So I think there's a lot of prior art of how to do it. You don't have to invent anything. We just have to sort of do it the difficult way, if you will.
You're doing a lot to help studios survive, succeed, innovate, which means that you yourself have to be doing that. How and where are you going to be innovating at Metaplay to keep this going, to keep connected with the needs of the studios, but also be meeting them or even anticipating them as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we actually do this is at Metaplay, we very consciously we bootstrap the company. So we don't have any investor money, any venture capital, which means that we essentially live or die on every single paycheck that we get month to month, which gives us a very sort of do or die focus on working with things that are immediately valuable. So we sort of have that need for a very, very quick feedback loop with our customers, with our studios. And the way we specifically do that is that we, with select studios, have this sort of white glove consulting relationship where we might have a weekly meeting, literally with the development team every single week, kind of sit in and listen to what they're working on and try to understand the dynamic of it and what is it hard, is it simple, are they using the things that we built, or are they annoyed at the things that we built, or like what's actually going on. And then funnily enough, that some oftentimes in fact leads into very, very small technical improvements, if you will, that might be very impactful to the people who actually have to live with the thing every single day. So that could be things like, real examples, trying to make better error messages and like collect them in a place where they're easier to find and more how would you say, more like politely presented that, did you know you made a mistake, and here's what we know about the mistake, and now's the perfect time to fix it while you're still working on the thing. And then like keep that sort of very empathetic momentum rolling. I'm getting philosophical about this, but like I feel like that's exactly the kind of stuff that we would not get unless we were there just talking with people kind of on a day-to-day level. And I think that, yeah, that's how we try to keep tabs. And the way I see that going in the future at the moment is that there are sort of two things that need improvement in all studios. One side is how do we make new games faster? So it's that new team, 5 people, super talented, extremely motivated. Let's solve that class of problems. So for us, it's things like quicker, easier deployments of servers, and like let's get the technical stuff just kind of happening on the background so that you can have a smaller team making new games faster. Very cool. Very cool. And then at the same time, in parallel, you have the top grossing games who absolutely do not care about your 5-person team problems, but instead are asking the question of not how do I get 10% more money, how do I double or even 10x the game over the next few years? And then we're talking about very complicated systems like seasonal leaderboards and so on that kind of have these career modes for players and like matchmake players in interesting ways and give them like recurring goals and so on. And that's very game specific, but those are difficult things to build. So we're trying to understand what are the sort of cutting edge long-term social meta things, and what do we as Metaplay build so it would be easier for you as a game developer to go and try those things out. And I think like we're seeing these two extremes over the next year and two kind of develop more and more and more. And we try to keep tabs on both of them, if that makes sense.
Before we say goodbye, there are 2 questions that we ask all of the guests who come onto the show. The first is, what are you playing right now? What's obsessing you? What's maybe on the phone in your pocket, even as we speak? And the second one, favorite game of all time. So, no pressure.
So first of all, I'm getting notifications right now on my phone about Squad Busters, an amazing game by Supercell. Apparently my tickets are full. I should go back and play. I've got 400 rounds in on it so far over the past couple of weeks. Such a good thing. We'll talk about that later. And the favorite game of all time, Civilization 1. Easy answer. Such an amazing thing back in the day. And that's also how I learned to cheat in games, because I wanted to get infinite money in Civilization. So I learned hex editing on my PC back in the day.
Well, there you go. You see, that's the sort of insight, and that's the sort of like searing geekery that we love to close out the show on. So we are definitely going to get you back, and we are going to drill down on that. But for now, thank you so much for coming along and speaking to us. We're really grateful, and yeah, so much for our audience to kind of unpack and think about from that.
Absolutely. And a plug for your blog series, which we will put in the show notes, Teemu. A real pleasure. And we'll be handing those along as well, because I'm sure people want to dive in. Thanks again. This show is all about how to do your job better, how to make an amazing game, how to market it, and you have a say. So if you have a story or know someone we need to shine a light on, then we would love to hear from you.
We want to hear from you. We want to reflect the reality of the mobile games market in all its wonderful complexity and strangeness. So if you have any suggestions for us, if you have any feedback for us, you can always get in touch. You can email us at podcast@pocketgamer.biz. You can find us on Twitter @PGBiz, and you can reach out to us through the pocketgamer.biz website. If you're interested in listening to all of our podcasts, you can find them at pocketgamer.biz/podcast, and we would love to hear your thoughts on future shows.
And we've got you covered on all the major platforms, so subscribe to the audio podcast, as Brian said. Look for us on YouTube. If you want to read it, hey, you can do that too, because we have a companion post for you as well on the pocketgamer.biz website.
Tune in again for the next edition of the pocketgamer.biz podcast, and we look forward to speaking to you in the near future.